And welcome back. Today, the US Supreme Court, the highest court in the United States of America, heard arguments in the tariff that Trump had imposed on countries around the world. And earlier, two courts previously, which includes a federal appeals court, had found against Donald Trump. For more, we speak to US Correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Sherwin, thank you so much for joining us. Really do appreciate it. Talk to me about what has been playing out in court, particularly around the implication and imposition of these tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Act. And of course, we know that the two previous courts said the act doesn't give him any such power, but at least three of the judges on that bench we know to be very close allies of Trump, have appointed by Trump, and have shown favor towards Trump in matters that have come before the Supreme Court of Appeal in the past. Those dynamics are quite sensitive, I would imagine.
You're correct, and as our colleague Nick Harper, reporting from Washington earlier, pointed out, that there is a 6-3 conservative majority led by Chief Justice John Roberts on that court. And this is a conservative-leaning court, Oliver, that has been broadly deferential to the president's executive authority, be that in deploying the National Guard or many other issues, firing heads of federal agencies that thought they were immune from executive authority. And so there's been broad deference from this court to the president. But as you correctly point out, at the center of this case is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA, which the president has used here as an overarching theme as to his determination of executive authority and emergency power here in terms of the imposition of tariffs. Let me briefly read you what the IEEPA says. It's a federal law that grants the president the authority to regulate international commerce and impose economic sanctions after declaring a national emergency in response to an external threat. So the question then becomes, is fentanyl flowing in from countries like Mexico, Canada, and China, which has been the accusation from the president, justification for the imposition of tariffs on these countries? Is the US trade deficit with various countries around the world justification for the deployment of his executive order under the authority of the IEEPA? And that is where the crux of the matter lies. And what you heard from both conservative justices on the court and the more liberal, progressive-leaning justices is the question as to whether the president is infringing on Congress's power to impose a tax on the American people, right? And if you view a tariff as a tax, which is certainly the perspective we heard from many of the judges on that court, then it would seem that the president is infringing his executive authority on the the legislative authority of Congress. And that is where this matter is going to come down to. If you look at what the Federal Appeals Court in August ruled in a 7-4 majority opinion, the majority of that court wrote in August that they could discern no clear congressional authorization for the Trump administration to use justifications as the importation of fentanyl across U.S. borders to impose broad tariffs on countries including Canada and China via a series of executive orders. So it really comes down to the point as to whether the president has the authority to tax. And so far, the broad indication is that he might not be able to do that.
Yeah. Look, the White House has already spoken about a plan B if the court were to rule against it. What would that plan B look like? I don't presume it means that he's actually going to let this go to Congress and then Senate, because that could take an incredibly long time. I mean, they still haven't been able to agree on the budget.
Well, two courts have ruled against this president, so I imagine that he might not only have a plan B, but a plan C and a plan D, right? And because the imposition of these tariffs has been a central economic tool, a central foreign policy tool since he took office in January this year. So let me read you what I've heard from, for example, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent in an interview with CNBC just yesterday. He said he expects tariffs to remain in place because the administration could switch to other legal authorities to underpin the tariffs. Quote, there are lots of other authorities that can be used by besides the IEEPA, but the IEEPA is by far the cleanest and gives the president the most negotiating authority. The others are more cumbersome, but they can be effective. So if he's not able to deploy the tariffs in terms of the IEEPA, we understand that there are maneuvers in the background right now in terms of using other legal authority to impose these tariffs, but one imagines that those too might very well then be challenged in the court. So this talks to great uncertainty about the future of these tariffs, the future of these punitive actions that in essence, the argument from the administration is that tariffs money will be pouring in from foreign countries, but there is a broad consensus among economists that actually it's Americans, it's US businesses that pay the import tax or the tariff. So this is a tax in many ways on the American population writ large.
Yeah, let's just quickly go back to that 6-3 conservative split on the bench. It's not all 6 of the conservative judges that are seemingly pro-Trump. At least 4 of them are quite clearly outrightly so, and that is Garouche, Barrett, Kavanaugh, and depending on which day of the week it is, Clarence Thomas. What sort of attitude did some of the judges show, the justices rather, show towards Trump's legal team when they heard arguments?
Well, I'll broadly say that the 3 progressive justices, the more liberal justices, appear dead against the president's authority to impose tariffs. And so it becomes instructive when you listen to, for example, a Chief Justice, John Roberts. I'll read you a question that he posed. He says, the imposition of taxes on Americans has been the core power of Congress, pointing to the fact that tariffs imposed are raising revenue, which the Constitution contemplates as the role or purview of Congress, not the president. So that's pretty instructive of where that conservative leading Chief Justice is heading. Then you also have Amy Coney Barrett, who you mentioned, on the IEEPA's language granting the president emergency powers to, quote, regulate importation encompasses the use of tariffs. She says, can you point, this is to the Solicitor General representing the administration, she says, can you point to any other place in the code or any time in history where the phrase regulate importation has been used to confer tariff imposing authority by the President of the United States? And so that, and then Elena Kagan, she's a progressive justice. She asks, the quintessential tax, or states rather, the quintessential taxing powers are given by the Constitution to Congress. So it's pretty clear where these judges with the majority appears to be leaning. There might be 2 or 3 that give the president some sort of deference in terms of his purview over foreign policy, which is essentially what he's using the tariffs for here. But given what we've seen from the lower courts, a lower court that is whose expertise lie within the trade, and then confirmed then by a 7-4 majority on the Federal Appeals Court, one just wonders if that would be undercut by the conservative leading majority on the Supreme Court or endorsed. And certainly the broad indication is that they might go and endorse the lower court's rulings in this case.
Has Trump said anything yet?
Not well, yesterday on the tariffs, yes, he said that this was a life or death issue for the country. With a victory, we have a tremendous but fair financial and national security. Without it, we are virtually defenseless against other countries who have for years taken advantage of us. So I'll read on. He says, our stock market is consistently hitting high records and our country has never been more respected than it is right now. A big part of this is the economic security created by tariffs and the deals we have negotiated because of them. Thank you for your attention to this matter. Look, South Africa, for example, is also very much engaged in finalizing a bilateral trade deal. As a result of the 30% imposition of tariffs on South Africa, one wonders what a Supreme Court ruling will do in terms of all the imposition of tariffs. So 30% here, the 49% I think it is in Switzerland, and the list goes on. And what then, what sort of tools the administration will use, because they gung-ho on keeping these tariffs in place. The question now becomes, what legal justification will they use if the Supreme Court rules against them?
Yeah. Trump has also said something very interesting about South Africa, and you mentioned there the 30% on tariff on South Africa. He also mentioned something very interesting at the American Business Forum where he appeared, where he seemingly mistakenly mentioned or made reference to South Africa hosting the G20 summit and sharing some views on that. Let's have a listen at this. I want to discuss that with you.
For generations, Miami has been a haven for those fleeing communist tyranny in South Africa. I mean, if you take a look at what's going on in parts of South Africa, look at South Africa, what's going on. Look at South America, what's going on. I'm not going to, we have a G20 meeting in South Africa. South Africa shouldn't even be in the Gs anymore, because what's happened there is bad. I'm not going. I told him I'm not going. I'm not going to represent our country there. It shouldn't be there.
Did he misread South America for South Africa?
You nailed it. You nailed it, absolutely. And then pivoted to South Africa to cover up the mistake. That's certainly my reading of it. I could be wrong. Maybe South Africa was written in the script. It
we're not a communist country.
In the context. Right, but people fleeing to Miami to escape communism, you think about Cuba, or you think maybe about Venezuela, but that's a long way from South Africa. I mean, you're better fleeing to Madagascar or to St. Helena than you are fleeing to Miami.
Yeah.
And so I think the president made a mistake and then sort of pivoted to cover up the mistake. And so in short, reasserting views we know are well established from this administration towards South Africa.
Well, maybe some of the white Afrikaner refugees found their way to Miami. Sherwin, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. US Correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease.